They brought him back at dusk. The light on the river turned to beaten copper and the gulls crying like children lost in a crowd. Men said a boar had gutted the king, that the forest had taken its due. But the man who rode the last mile into the mud gate hardly looked like a king who had married death. His cloak was torn and filthy, his chest bandaged crooked and tight enough to show the surge of breath beneath, and his beard was matted with blood and bracken. Yet Robert Baratheon sat straight in the saddle with a face like black stone and a hand that never once trembled on the reins. He did not speak to the prentice boys or the grinning women who leaned from balconies to see him pass. He did not even spare a curse for the butcher carts clogging the way. He came through the gates as though he were an iron-shod storm breaking against his own walls, and the city withdrew from him, murmuring. In the yard below Maegor's holdfast, torches flared and hissed. Eddard Stark met him there, broad-shouldered and grave, and set a steadying hand to the king's elbow when Robert swung down. The smell was thick and rank. Pig, sweat, blood, horse. Lancel Lannister hovered with a flagon under his arm and a bow that never finished, as if he'd forgotten what it meant. Somewhere in the shadows Sandor Clegane's laugh cut like a nail across tin. "My lord," Robert said, and only when he spoke did they hear how raw his voice had been scraped. "You were right to keep the gate clear. You sent word you were hurt," Ned said. Even in the torchlight the bandage showed a blot of through blood the color of rust. It had not spread. "I feared the worst." "Did you?" Robert's grin was without mirth. "Seven hells. King or boar, I'm still hard to kill." He let Ned and Barristan Selmy guide him into the cool inner air, past pale maids who tried to make themselves smaller and a skinny potboy who tripped over his own feet to get out of the way. The corridor smelled of rushes and beeswax, the way royal corridors ought to smell, not of dead leaf rot and mud and fear. The king paused to brace one hand on the stone. His breath went rougher, then eased. He did not look behind him, where Lancel's shadow trembled like a snared hare. "I had 3 cups before we lowered the spears," Robert said. He lifted his head to glance at Lancel at last, eyes narrow. "Sweet wine, sweet as summer. And you kept filling, didn't you, boy?" Lancel's throat worked. "Your grace asked." "My grace asks for 100 things a day," Robert spat. "Small folk ask the gods. You keep your master alive when you can." He made a low sound. It could have been laughter or pain. "We're not done, you and I," he said in a voice as mild as winter sun. "Get out." Lancel got out. He stumbled. The echoes followed. Ned waited until they had shut the doors to the king's chamber and the servants had scuttled away, until only Barristan and Varys and Pycelle and a pair of pale king's guard in white cloaks remained against the wall like winter ghosts. The bed was set with clean linen. The fire was well up, and a jug steamed gently on an iron trivet that made the scent of mint creep into the room. "You should sit," Ned said. "I'll stand." Robert tugged at the bond of linen and winced. He chose a chair by the hearth in the end and fell into it with a grunt. For a long breath they said nothing. There was only the crackle of the fire and the faint, trickling sound of the pot. When the king spoke again, he did it to the flames. Boar came out of the little stand by the rocks. "I saw him late. I saw him slow." "You bled," Barristan said. His voice was fruit with smoke, gentle and old and full of years. "The boar is dead, your grace. We hung the head. Hang it on Joff's wall. He loves beasts." Robert rubbed at his eyes with the heel of his hand, and when he dropped the hand, the skin around his eyes looked older by a decade. "No, not Joff's wall," he corrected himself almost lazily. "The boy has too much pride as it is." Ned glanced to Varys then, because it was in him to watch the way the eunuch's eyes never seemed to settle in one place for long, and because truth required seeing who it might scrape against. Varys was all powder and silk and careful sadness. He folded his hands delicately. "I am overfull of relief at your grace's return," the eunuch said in the tone of a man offering a blessing over a grave. "The realm is overfull of my debts," Robert snapped. "That will keep." He leaned forward, the chair creaking under him. "Ned." "Yes. You brought me a book." "I did. Ned's hand felt heavy on the leather. He took the thick volume from beneath his arm, curious little golden studs winking like stars, and set it upon the table by Robert's knee. The seed is strong. I know what it says. Robert's mouth wrenched. I know black from gold, and I know my brother Stannis, and the law he wraps himself in. Pycelle, standing very straight though his back wanted to bow, made a sound like an old door closing. Your Grace, if I might, lineage is a labyrinth even to the most learned and— Don't piss me a lecture, Robert said without looking at him. His gaze slid to Ned and stayed. You told me to look with my own eyes. I did. Outside, a gull cried like a hinge. The sound lifted and fell and lifted again, a thin blade. Ned kept his voice level, though some part of him felt the ground shift underfoot, as it had on a winter lake when he was a boy and the ice gave its first low groan. Then you know. Robert stared into the hearth until his face turned to iron in the light. If it's a lie, it's a rich one, he said. All those black-haired bastards scattered across the city. That armorer's boy with his bull's head dreams. Even the girl with the berry eyes down by the street of silk. She had a babe on her hip with a head of night. And me? I've sired a brood like a hedge full of crows. Yet not one golden hair on a single trueborn. Varys made a soft, thoughtful sound. Barristan watched the king's face without blinking. Ned said, We could be cautious. There are other proofs. I don't need more proofs, Robert said. I need a hammer. For a moment, Ned saw only the boy he had loved on the long road south to war. Laughing with a stag's antlers tied to his helm, his hands scarred, his wrists strong enough to make a maul sing. Duty had starved the laughter. Wine had drowned it. Yet the man who sat before the fire now was the same man who had broken Rhaegar on the trident, and something of that old strength had come back to sit with him like an old friend returned across a bridge that held only for him. Robert rose. He moved as a man with a knife in his side might move, but he rose. Call the council, he said to no one and everyone. Send for the queen and the princes. Send for my sister's son. Send for the Lord Commander. We'll have done with cowards' whispers. He turned his head, slow, to Varys. If the city watch is bought, I will know the price and who said it. The eunuch bowed, and in that silken bend of his Ned heard the smallest rustle of satisfaction, or perhaps imagined it. The spider always liked to watch the web tremble. Your Grace, Barristan said, formal, a man being given the work his life had taught him. I will see it done. The bells of the Great September were still ringing vespers when the throne room filled. They came with their house guards and their allies and their shadows. Gold cloaks glinted like sunburnt wheat along the walls. The king's guard stood like pillars of bone behind the dais. Janos Slynt had a mouth made for swallowing and eyes almost delicate in their lids. He kept flicking his gaze toward Peter Baelish, who smiled in the way of a butcher's cat, as if all the hens in the world were doing fine and hadn't the slightest cause to cluck their silly heads. Pycelle smelt faintly of mints and dust. Varys glowed. Ares Oakhart held himself stiff and fair and very young. Meryn Trant looked like an ox taught to wear a white cloak. In the high gallery, a handful of singers and courtiers and ladies had gathered like tinsel shaken loose from a tree. Cersei Lannister came in green silk and pearls, her hair a sheet of new coin in the torchlight. She walked with a lioness's grace, and behind her came Joffrey, chin up, eyeing the hall as if it offended him by existing. Tommen and Myrcella trailed dutifully, their faces open and uncertain. Jaime Lannister was already by the dais, the white of his cloak brighter even than the marble, his hand resting on the pommel of a sword that needed no introduction anywhere in Westeros. He had the lazy, cruel mouth that came upon him whenever he meant to be purely amused. Robert did not wear a crown. His bandage lay beneath black velvet as dark as his hair. He took the dais like a boulder taking its place in a river. For a moment the hall hummed, featherlight, and then the hum fell into a hush dead enough to hear the breath of men 3 paces away. My queen, Robert said. Your Grace, Cersei said. His Grace did nothing to sweeten the word. She looked at the bandage with naked contempt and at Ned with a loathing so pure it might have been a jewel. Come forward, Robert said. "Bring the boy." Joffrey stepped without being asked. He set his hands on his hips and tossed his hair back. He had Cersei's mouth and Jaime's eyes, and none of Robert's anything. "Mother, why are we summoned like servants?" He did not lower his voice. "Because you are," Robert said, "a servant of the crown, which is the realm, which is me." He lifted a hand, and Ser Barristan spoke without prompting. "The king will be heard," Barristan said, his voice the sound of a sword drawn very slowly. "Lord Pycelle," Robert said, "read from the book my hand will provide." He did not take his eyes from Cersei when Ned handed over the heavy leather-bound thing. Pycelle fumbled, peered, and began to drone. "Lord Tytos Lannister wed Jane Marbrand," the Grand Maester read, "and begot Lord Tywin, Ser Kevin, Jenna, Tyget, and Jerian. Lord Tywin wed Lady Joanna, and begot—" "Skip," Robert said. "Hand him another page. He'll read until spring otherwise." Ned had marked the passage. Pycelle cleared his throat. "A study of the descent of seed from Lord Stephen Baratheon through his son King Robert," the old man read. "The issue of his body acknowledged and otherwise, with attention to phenotypes of hair and countenance across 4 generations." "We need not drown the hall in your learning," Robert said, almost kindly. "Say what is plain to the eye." Pycelle faltered. He looked to Cersei and then away. In every branch of House Baratheon as far back as the records have been kept, the male line produces dark hair, raven black in many cases. It is consistent." "Consistent," Robert repeated. "And my lawful children?" The old man moist-toed his lips. If they were yours, your grace, they would likely bear that mark." Cersei's smile could have cut glass. "Likely," she said. "Not certain. Maester's hedge. It is their way. A mother's milk is the only proof in this world, and I gave it, until you filled my breasts with bitterness." Robert's gaze did not move. "Ser Jaime," he said without turning. "Your grace," Jaime drawled, bored already. "Step forward." "Ah," Jaime said, and in that soft syllable was mischief and danger and a lifetime of long looks that had never yet met their punishment. He came to stand 2 steps from the dais. He looked up. "We are all very serious today. Have I done some remarkable thing I should be thanked for? If so, I've forgotten it." Joffrey laughed, bright and shrill. The sound skipped like a pebble across a pond, hit too often. "It would be a mercy," Robert said, "if you forgot this also, for all our sakes." He looked at Cersei. "Say it is false." "You have your witnesses," Cersei said. Her lips were pale where her teeth pressed them. "Your books, your hedgerow bastards." She lifted her chin. "Say what you mean. You never lacked for bluntness in a brothel." "Lady," Ned said. "You will address me as queen," she said, still not looking at him. Robert's hand closed on the carved arm of his seat until his knuckles went the color of bone. When he spoke, his voice hit the room like one of his hammer blows. "It is treason to put other men's seed in a king's bed and call the get mine," he said. "Treason and worse. It is a sickness in the realm's bones. It has eaten us for years. Today it stops." Joffrey's laughter died as if a blade had cut it. "What do you mean?" He took a step forward, face flushed. "I am the heir. I am. You are nothing of mine," Robert said, and the words were cruel and broke something in him as he said them. "You are a boy your mother made to sneer at the world when the world never gave you cause to earn it. Get you behind." Where the hall had been a hush, now it was a shiver. The king's words gathered themselves and began to move through the listeners like a cold wind, like a rumor with a sword. "Seize the queen's brother," Robert said into it. The movement that followed had its own kind of quiet. Barristan did not look to the left or right. He made a small sign with 2 fingers, and Ares Oakhart and Preston Greenfield stepped forward. Jaime did not draw in that first heartbeat, and then he did, and the bright thing he held was the very sword that had made a throne spare itself an old king. He smiled. "Do you want a song of it?" he asked and swayed. Aerys and Preston came on together like men trained for the dance and long at it. Jaime flowed between them with a sudden blaze that made torchlight jump. Steel rang off steel, and the sound rose into the rafters. Baratheon moved then, quicker than his years should have allowed, his own blade a pale swan's neck. He came low and to the side with a cut to take Jaime's ankle, and the Lannister twisted and drove a thrust at Aerys that blurred in the air. Aerys's white cloak tore and flared like a sail. He tumbled and rolled, and when he rose, blood made a blossom on his sleeve. "Stand down!" Barristan's voice had never sounded young, but it had never sounded like winter until now. Jaime retreated a pace by grace alone. His boot heel found the step and nearly betrayed him. He took the measure of the room and of the king and of the numbers and of all the years he had stood in white, and he laughed only that once, sharply, like a brilliant coin snapped in two. "For love?" He asked Cersei, and the look they shared then was naked enough to be obscene. Her mouth hardly moved. "For love," she said. Jaime tossed his sword. It skidded and rang at Barristan's feet. He lifted his chin, and Aerys Oakheart stepped in to clap irons to his wrists. The sound of the steel bite was very small. Joffrey said in a dead boy's voice, "Mother," and reached for her hand. She did not see him. The hall held its breath. Robert rose again from the throne. He looked down at Joffrey as if at a painting that had been badly done. "You'll be kept in rooms fitting to your station," he said. "We'll see a septon to you. We'll see if prayer can make you gentle." "And what is my station?" the boy choked. You dare. Be quiet," Robert said without heat. And as if the words reached farther than sound, Joffrey found himself without breath or speech. Tears gathered, ill-contained, at the corners of his eyes. He was very young then. Even Cersei looked at him at last, as if a memory had startled her. She said, "You cannot shame me," almost conversationally. "I have no shame for you to peel." Robert faced her. "It's justice I mean to peel." Janos slint. "My lord." Janos bobbed, his lower lip slick. "See the queen to rooms within the holdfast. She is not to quit them without my leave." "And the children?" Varys inquired gently. Robert's jaw worked. "They remain at court." He looked to Ned. "My brother Stannis is heir. I'll have letters out before Vespers bells end their toll, and 100 banners on the roads by morning. We will have judges. We will have truth. And we'll hold these children under my protection until the realm knows what it must know." Cersei's smile came again, thin with contempt and something like awe. "They will sing of your mercy," she said, "but not the way you hope." She went with a rustle like silk being torn very slowly. Jaime went between Aerys and Preston, silent at last, the loose ends of his white cloak dragging like a shroud. Joffrey had to be touched on the arm twice before he moved. Tommen had begun to cry in a gulping way that made his cheeks blotch. Myrcella, too stubborn for tears, looked to Ned Stark with a queerly measuring gaze, and he, who had 7 of his own, bowed his head just enough to honor her little courage. Later, when the torches had burned lower and the night breeze pressed through the arrow slit like a hand and withdrew again, Ned stood with Robert by a casement and listened to the city like the sea. "You will need allies," Ned said. His voice seemed to come from far away. "Lord Tywin will not accept this quiet." "Let him choke on it," Robert said. He had a fresh bandage that made his breath tight. "We have the city. We have the law. We have Barristan Bloody Selmy. And Stannis," Ned said, which was to say, iron and hunger and the knife's edge. Robert made a sound in his throat. "A hard brother and a hard fate." He set his hands on the stone and stared out into the dark. "I knew this day would come, Ned. I did not know it would be me to call it." "You were a better friend than king," Ned said, because the time for lies had passed and because the truth was as much a kind of friendship as ale. Robert's head turned and the shadow of his mouth tugged. "And you were a better hand than I deserved." They wrote the letters with Varys's tiny sand to keep the ink quick and Janos Slint's men to run them to the messenger's hall. Robert's hand steadied when it came to Stannis's name. He pressed the seal with such force that the stag showed as if hammered into the wax. 1 letter went to Dragonstone by fast galley, 1 to the Eyrie, 1 to Riverrun, 3 to Stormland castles, a dozen to every little lord who needed reminding that his bread was made of king's grain. Littlefinger stood by the window and pursued dust motes with his eyes, as though they had coins hidden inside them. When sleep finally took the city into its long, slow yawn, Cersei lay upon a divan in her confinement. The room had a painted ceiling with gods and vines. A septa sat stiffly near the door, her mouth aseam. Cersei stared at the play of lamplight on the arched windows and felt the hollow in her gut where fear lay, coiled and precise. She had never been frightened of Robert. She had been bored by him, and disgusted and furious, and triumph made flesh in front of his clumsiness. Fear was for a different sort of man, one who saw clean. She brushed her hair until it sparked against her cheek and thought of her father. Tywin Lannister received the Raven in a tent that smelt of leather and salt beef and steel. The Riverlands lay across his maps like a deer quartered on a butcher's board. The fire gave his face a color like copper. He broke the seal with 2 fingers and read twice. The first time his jaw fixed. The second time he breathed. Kevan watched him. "Well, insolence," Tywin said softly, "and proof of the king's folly." Kevan said nothing. "Jaime is taken," Tywin said. The words were drier than old parchment. "The girl is held. The boy is declared a whelp of incest. The king thinks the law protects him." "You'll call the banners," Kevan said, "because there were things you said in such times, the way you blessed a bride even if she was walking to a call. D hearth and a cold man." "The banners are called," Tywin said. "Gregor, send him to guard the road by the Blackwater. If the king marches west, he will march through fire." "Gregor is—" "Gregor," Kevan said. "Gregor is my fist," Tywin replied. At Dragonstone, Stannis Baratheon read the same message upon the stone sill of a narrow window and said, in that way he had of cutting to bone with only the sound of words, "It comes late." Davos Seaworth stood by in his patched cloak and thought of the smell of onions under winter rain. "Late," Stannis repeated. "But true." He pressed the seal hard under his thumb. "Fetch Maester Cresson. We'll have proclamation written and ships made ready. The king calls. The law calls." Renly Baratheon received his letter in a flowered bower in Highgarden, where Lord Mace Tyrell had laid such a table as priests set for gods, and Loras Tyrell sat with 1 boot heel hooked on a chair and a ribbon in his hair because he could. Renly read, then smiled the way a man smiles who sees a game at last that might amuse him. "Stannis," he said. "Stannis," Loras repeated, but he made the name into something like a jest. "The realm overflows with joy." Renly folded the parchment. "If the king has lived to father his wits at last, I should be glad. But my brother will make a winter of summer if you give him the chance." He leaned back. "Let's ride tomorrow. I've had my fill of roses. I want to smell salt and iron. I want to be at court when they line the lioness for the chain." In the Red Keep, Sansa Stark learned from her septa that the queen would not be coming to supper and that she herself was to eat in her rooms. She looked down at the lace on her cuffs and did not cry, though later she sat at her window and watched the torches bloom on the walls like flowers and thought of Joffrey's hand in hers and the way he had looked at her as if she was a cup he wanted to own. She had thought that a prince's glance was a gift. She had not known it could be a knife. In the practice yard, Arya Stark danced with Syrio Farrell until sweat made her hair stick to her cheek and her arm burned. She heard the news by the clattering rumor of boys and by the little stiff way the guards watched the doors. Syrio said, "Good," and flicked her shoulder with the wooden sword when she turned her head. "Look with your eyes, little one, else you will have no head to turn." Ned slept for a few hours in a chair in the chamber adjoining the king's. The dream he had was winter overlaid upon spring, snow upon apple blossoms, and a child's laughter over the groan of ice. When he woke, his neck hurt. He washed in water gone lukewarm by the brazier and went in to Robert, who had not slept. "I will confess," Robert said without rising. His eyes were set deep and clear, like a mountain pool. "I thought I would rage more. Turns out tired is what I am. Tired and done with being made a fool." "It isn't done," Ned said. Robert smiled slightly. "I know. He pushed to standing. The linen at his ribs tugged darkly but did not leak. Call the September. We'll have charges laid. The gods can hear what men already do. The charges were read in the throne room with a great deal more ceremony than the truth needed. Pycelle ate words like a cow ate grass and brought them up again in cud. Varys stood very still and watched the courtiers watching each other. Littlefinger traced a finger along the banister and dusted it against his sleeve with exaggerated care. Janos Slynt stood at his ease like a butcher who had discovered that talking to lords paid better than cutting throats by contract. Cersei wore white as bold as Jaime's cloak and looked past the throne to the sword above it. You may claim trial in the manner of the Seven, the High Septon intoned. If the gods are willing. The gods are willing when men are not, Cersei said. She turned her head very slightly toward the gallery where the few brave or foolish had gathered to spy on their rulers. I claim it, for me and for the truth, which will not be strangled with a book. Who is your champion? The High Septon asked, and pretended ignorance like an old man feigning that he has not seen the mouse go under the cupboard. Cersei smiled. The room had cooled, though no one could have said when. Ser Gregor, she said, of House Clegane. There were murmurs then, and fear moved like a fish in a pond. The water didn't rise, but it suddenly showed edges of a shape. Gregor Clegane came to court with a stain on his sleeve that seemed always new. He had killed for the Lannisters in the Riverlands because Tywin needed villages made into examples. He would kill now for the same reason men wore lions on their chests. They were a family that loved pictures of itself. Who stands for the crown? The High Septon asked. Barristan Selmy could have stepped forward. It would have been a song a minstrel would sing with clean tears and an old lute. But Robert looked down the line of the Kingsguard, and his gaze stopped at Sandor Clegane. The hound's face crawled with that old ruin of fire and scorn. He held his hands loose and bored, and he did not look toward his brother because he never did. When the king's gaze made the last step and arrived at him, Sandor Clegane lifted one shoulder with a creak of leather. Ida's like, he said. It's yours, Robert said. Joffrey made a noise and then caught it before it escaped his teeth. His hands were fists at his sides. Tommen had gone very pale. Myrcella stared at Sandor's scars as at a map. Cersei's mouth trembled and then stilled. The day they chose was overcast. A raw wind came bag by bag under the walls and lifted the flags on their staff heads as if they were trying to get away. They set the lists in the outer yard to make it a public thing, though the gates stood shut. The commoners gathered on the far side of the iron lattice like sheep brought to market to see if they had been grown fat enough to make the butcher smile. The royal box rose beneath a canopy of faded red. The queen's chair stood empty, with a spray of pearl set upon its seat like a joke. The ground was damp, just enough to gather in the cleats of a man's boots and hold him. Gregor came out in gray iron, and the helm on his head turned the day around it even duller. The sword he carried would have been a two-hand blade for a lesser man. He swung it to rest across his shoulder as thought it weighed no more than a broom. He looked at Sandor, and the slit in his helm did not change. The hound wore a plainer thing and no helm, because he liked to feel the wind on his scars and because he had worked too long for Lannisters to hide his ugliness from them. He had a long sword that had cut commoners and knights and boys who got in the way. He spat in the dirt. Barristan spoke over them with formality enough to cover such a rift as lay between them. He finished with, "Let the gods decide." And the silver drums in the gallery rolled a little and then steadied, as if their players had remembered at the last that too much noise cheapened death. The opening was ugly, which was to say it was real. Gregor came on like a miller's wheel. Sandor gave ground to the third step because he always did when his brother was the one to come forward. Saved his life. The great blade went past his breast with a hiss like a kettle, and when Sandor's riposte struck Gregor's vambrace, its bite was like teeth on a bell. They moved through 3 exchanges that no minstrel would sing, the gristle and board scrape kind of fighting that knights pretended was beneath them until they were bleeding. In the third pass, Gregor feinted high and hammered low. The blow skidded along Sandor's thigh and sent up an arc of wet. The hound grunted and came up into his brother, close enough to smell whatever a man like that smelled like. Metal and old leather and stale rage. He shoved with the guard and felt the give and twisted and dipped his head, and then he was clear and dancing to the side, as much as a big man ever danced. The crowd made a noise like surf when a storm lifts. Robert leaned forward in his chair. Ned watched Sandor's footwork and thought of a little girl in a yard with a Bravosi stick and a man's voice saying the water moves and so must you. He watched Cersei's face. She didn't blink. Fire flared. Not the green of wildfire, not the crackling hiss of pine pitch, only a ragged tongue that took a lick of lint from a torch someone had placed too close to the lists. The breath of it went over Sandor's cheek like a lover unwelcome. He froze for a quarter of a heartbeat. That was all the time Gregor needed to shove him with the flat of the great sword. Sandor staggered. He caught his heel on the churned earth. His shoulder hit the rail and splintered it. Give me courage, Ned thought, and he didn't know for whom. Sandor came off the rail with blood running down his thigh into his boot and his breath a snarl. He went very still. The fire had burned itself out on the damp and the wind had taken its smell away. He came at Gregor the way a dog came for a boar's hind leg. Quick from the side and low, where the boar could not bring its tusks. The first cut was at the back of Gregor's knee. The blade kissed the joint and opened leather. Gregor stepped and turned, and Sandor's second stroke went for the hand on the hilt. The old trick. Gregor pulled and the steel rasped along his gauntlet instead with a riven scree. In the north they said that once two wolves had fought on a lake and the ice had cracked and taken both. This was like that. You could hear the strain of iron on iron and the low music of men breathing around their pain. Gregor found Sandor's shoulder and drove. Plate shrieked. Sandor slid under, his hair briefly catching on a rivet, and his blade went up blindly, almost a prayer. It found a weakness where gorget met breast. It slipped, scraped, took the angle by luck or gods or something born in boys when they learned to survive. It went in. Gregor's bellow did not sound human. He yanked himself off the steel with a sound that was worse. Blood came bright and dark both. He made two great blind swipes, and if the second had met a man instead of air, it would have made pulp of him. Sandor disengaged to his left, and the third cut came lazy and war-mad and went nowhere. Gregor took 2 steps, one after the other like a man remembering how to walk. He lifted his sword. He took another step. He fell to his knees. He did not kneel. The yard said nothing at all. Baratheon did not need to say it, but he did. The gods have judged. Cersei's fingers clenched, so slightly that only those who'd spent their lives watching body and breath would have seen it. She rose without hurry. "Then the gods are fools," she said, but mildly, as if she were discussing a dish that had been oversalted. "You will await sentencing," Robert said. The wind lifted his hair from his bandage. "You are guilty of treason and of whoredom with your brother. 7 help you when they hear how the realm staggers for the bastard boys you set upon it." "My son is still a prince," Cersei said. "Your seal cannot make him other than he is." She smiled at Sandor with a candor he had never deserved and would never have asked. "Well fought, dog," she added. "Bitch," he replied without heat. They took her back to the holdfast. Joffrey would have followed if Janos Slint had not laid a hand on his arm that moved like a snake quick strike and pressed just so. When the boy turned on him, the commander only looked down with the bland, stubborn pity of a stone lintel. Myrcella went without making a murmur, and Tommen with hiccuping sobs that grew softer the farther he walked. Ned stood with Robert in the wind. "What do you mean to do with her?" Ned asked. "What the law lets me," Robert said. "What mercy doesn't forbid." He glanced sideways. "You do love mercy." "It is duty I love," Ned replied, and had to wonder if that was true and if loving duty was not the same as loving the crows who came when duty had been done and pecked at what was left. "Law says heads," Robert said. "Mercy says prisons. Mercy says walls and silence and a life of days each like the last." He watched the sky for a beat. "Mercy it will be. I won't be remembered as a man who hacked his queen to meet in a courtyard. I was not made to be remembered at all. I was made to break enemies and then break myself on wine." "Don't," Ned said, and then held his tongue. Robert made a rough sound and did not answer. If the gods had given them quiet after, the realm might have mended. The gods did not. Tywin Lannister sent riders and ravens in silk-wrapped talk into every hall that housed a man who had ever envied a stag's velvet. And by the time the lists had been taken down, the West had risen. News went like a wind from the mountains. The Golden Tooth shut its doors, Ser Adam Marbrand gathered fires along the Gold Road, Craighall sharpened its boar spears, and to the south, along the Mander, Reach lords began to count their haystacks and decide if the stag or the lion would eat them. Robert answered like the man he had been before he was a king. He buckled on a gorget that creaked as it settled, and he had his hammer brought up from the armory, the old one, the one with the head that had cracked Rhaegar's rubies and sent red into the trident like a bed of poppies uprooted. "We take the road west," he said. "We stamp their claws in their own dust." Ned had a list of names he liked to turn in his head sometimes when he could not sleep. Men he could trust. Men he thought he could not and found he could. He put the list aside. "You should not ride," he said. "And I should not drink," Robert replied. "And I should not whore, and yet here we are." He laid the hammer's face upon the table, and it thumped with a promise. "I'll not sit my arse and send good men to die without me. I want Tywin to feel my foot in his throat." "You have an heir," Ned said. "You will have a queen again. Do not spend yourself." Robert looked at him, and there was kindness in it. "Honor, honor," he said without contempt. "If it's fear for me, keep it. I am afraid already. I am afraid I'll begin again to be the boy who laughed because he couldn't bear to think. If I keep still." Baratheon chose the men. Janos Slynt made certain the city watch would stay loyal with the city's coin in his belly. Littlefinger found gold enough for the stores that moved with them. Varys arrayed his whisperers as if he were putting on rings for a mask. The Hound took a place among the king's vanguard as if he had not just killed the brother who had made his childhood a roast. The Stark girls stood upon a wall and watched the royal party ride. Sansa with her hands like folded birds and Arya with her fingers hooked through the crenel like a boy. The sun came through for the first time in a day and made the armor shine. They met Adam Marbrand on a windy sweep of ground below a line of low hills where the grass had been chewed down to dirt by the hooves of men and mounts. There was a burnt farmstead not far off, a black skeleton with smoke still thinking about rising from it. Robert drew rein and the wind hit him full at the chest and made him grin with an old savagery. "They've been here," he said. "They'll be here again." Marbrand had a better sense of ground. He came at them in a long slant, not a charge, testing, and Robert answered with a wedge that had broken other men in other years and remembered how. The clash made the air ring like struck bronze. Ned rode in the second rank with a shield that had been his father's and the Stark banner snapping behind him like cloth trying to become a bird and failing. He saw a boy with 2 wisps of beard bring his horse up too short and catch an arrow where his gorget met his jaw. He saw Barristan take a blow on his shoulder and not feel it until later, when the blood dried and cracked. He saw Robert swing the hammer and saw a knight in gilded armor turn suddenly into a man who fell in pieces. The battle was a thing that moved like an animal trying to become a river and never learning how. It ran and stopped and ran again and each time found a new shape. When it ended, the field held iron dropped like sudden crops and men who had gone to sleep without deciding to. The wind moved again, only wind, and bore the smell of cut grass and opened bellies. Robert stood with the hammer head on his boot and the handle against his shoulder and looked for Tywin as if he might somehow appear. "A taste," he said with a black contentment that was not pleasure but the memory of it. "Only that. Tywin will not meet you in the open," Ned said. "He will pull you farther, and then further still, and bite you when you've slept badly." Robert wiped the hammer with a rag until it shone dull and even. He looked at the rag. He looked at the field. He said, "Good," very softly. "Then I'll chase him until he must turn." When they rode again, the sky had gone the dirty color it gets when the last of the day's blue has been scraped away. Men had tied strips of clean cloth to their arms in token of victory, as if a bit of linen could keep a ghost from finding you. The road westward went pale where the moon began to consider its rising.
Ned råder af Roberts sne.
For a while neither spoke. At last, the king said, so quiet that the hoofbeats might have been louder, "Tell me of that boy again, the armorer's whelp." Gendry, Ned said. He is strong-muscled. He has a stubbornness that would shame a mule. He wanted nothing from me but to be taught to work steel, and he looked at me as if I were plotting to steal his hammer when I told him he had a gift. Stannis' heir, Robert said, clean and quick. The realm will need a man of law to follow me. The realm will need a man of love to follow me, too. Not for the throne. He added with a breath that might have been a laugh and might have been a little groan from deep in him. I know the law. I am not what I was, but I am not a fool. But a boy can be made a lord. A boy can be made a stag under law. The realm might like it better to look at a black head than a bald one. Stannis will not, Ned said. I know, Robert replied. He squinted into the west. We will make him remember he loved me once. Beyond the city, far across the narrow sea, a woman with silver hair whose belly quickened with a life the small folk would have called a coin toss between gifts and curses, dreamed of heat that did not burn and eggs that did not hatch in a tower with bells that rang of salt. A man with a face like a child's in the wrong light sharpened a sickle and thought of pears. A red woman looked into a brazier and saw a stag wounded but not fallen, and then saw a shadow like a great bird pulling its wings over a city. And she smiled because she did not yet know the name of that city or the man who better loved law than people. The world drew a breath. King's Landing drew its own kind. It was the breath of a city that had been fearful and then bold and then fearful again. A long sigh that never ended. In Maegor's Holdfast, Cersei sat at a window where once another Targaryen woman had worn her needlework thin, watching for a husband who never came back. Cersei's hair streamed under a piece of blue silk she wore for modesty, like a jest. A small plate of sugared nuts stood at her elbow untouched. When Varys came, he slid into the chamber without visible movement, like a drop of oil finding a seam in wood. "My lady," he said. "My lord," she returned. They had always called each other nothing true. "The king has taken the road west," he said. "He leaves the city in the hands of Lord Stark." He folded his pale hands. "The people are with them for now. They have had their spectacle. They like it when truth is made into a show and they are allowed to clap. And you?" "I like a quiet realm," Varys said, and that at least was something like a truth. Quiet realms are easy on little birds, and there is always someone who needs to buy a song. Cersei smiled in the way that suggested knives in the ground at a man's back, the kind he would find only when he lay down to rest. "I have 3 children," she said. "One should have been king by rights, if we lived in a world that knew what rights were. One is a sweet boy. One is a girl who learns quickly. I have lost 2 champions and a brother to a butcher and a king who woke up too late. I will not lose all. Do you understand me?" Varys's lashes were long and absurd on a face like his. "There are ships," he said gently. "Ships leave quietly. Ships return quietly. It is possible to vanish for a while and let the realm grow used to your absence. It is possible to make a story that hurts less than the truth." Cersei's smile did not change. "And who do I leave in the lion's den? My whoreson's son in a sept?"
No.
She leaned forward. "If my father comes, and he will come with teeth. You spider may spin how you like. I will have something more substantial than thread." "You will not find allies in this city," Varys murmured. "There is only the watch, and men who smell which way meat drips its fat and lick at the drips." "I will find allies in myself," Cersei said. "Which is enough." "Enough for what?" "To make them pay when the hour comes," she said softly. "It will come. Give my father my love when you slither to him. He will save it in a jar and use it like oil." Varys bowed as if she had given him a compliment worth having. On the 3rd day after the field below the low hills, they found smoke to the west and roads churned by too many feet. On the 5th, they found corpses hanging from a poplar, each with a square of leather sewn to his breast. The squares were stamped with a lion. On the 7th, scouts came running with talk of a force making for the Blackwater along a little stream that fed it, and Robert said, "At last," in the way a man says it who has finally located the door he has been groping for in the dark. He found Gregor's remnant there, and more than remnants, and men under Adam Marbrand who had seen how Robert had fought and had decided that this time they would do it from farther away. There were archers with barrels set before them like tables laid, and every barrel held arrows. The ground was a slope that liked a man better if he ran down it than if he stood at the top. The stream gurgled like a throat. Robert grinned. "He thinks me a boar," he said. "Let's show him a hunter." The plan Ned made then was not clever. Clever plans were for men who did not expect to be hit. He split the vanguard and sent the hound wide with 100 of the best horse and kept his shield wall tight enough that a man could feel another man's sweat through his leathers. He sent Baratheon with 50 to harry the archers who had imagined they would have time to lay their arrows out like spoons. When they went down the slope, their legs shook from holding and then didn't, and their voices lifted because if you shouted sometimes the fear came out with it. It was ugly again. Beauty had fled war long before. Ned saw Robert take an arrow in his mail and curse because it stung through. He saw Janos Slint's cousin or brother or some man who looked like him go down and not rise. He saw Sandor lift a man clear off the ground by the throat and fling him into the stream, and what came up again was not a man. He saw Adam Marbrand cut through 2 men to reach Baratheon, and he saw Baratheon stumble, and he was close enough to make a difference. He rammed his shield up under Marbrand's sword and took the blow on the rim. His arm sang to the bone. He thrust, a short stabbing thrust meant for armor gaps, and felt the prayer of it answered. Marbrand cried out, astonished, and reeled, and Barristan's pommel took him across the temple and dropped him. When it was done, the west had gone, like a hard rain shower that rips leaves and then moves on and leaves the air smelling clean and the ground ragged. They took prisoners enough to tell them what Tywin wanted them to hear. He was moving south, the man said, who had a broken front tooth and hands stained by old work. He was not going to be pinned. He would cover the road with men and smoke and hunger. He would make Robert pay for every inch like a miser and never show his face. "Good," Robert said again, and there was something in him that had not been there when they had ridden out. It might have been a kind of peace. In the city, the days made a rhythm of bread and quiet and whispers. Sansa sat at her embroidery frame and pierced and drew and pierced and thought how the sound of a needle might be like a very small sword if you could make it so. Arya learned how to slip from shadow to shadow in corridors she had run for play, and she ate in the kitchens with boys who did not know her name and would have been afraid to if they had. Varys's birds learned new songs and came to his hands for sweets. He kept in a little carved box of bone. Littlefinger watched the coin move like fish in a shallow river and speculated whether there were bigger fish and who had nets he could borrow. Joffrey came to the sept every morning like a penitent ruined of company. He sat with a face like a mask and mouthed words and thought of lions and of swords and of a day when the men who had laughed would be bone in his mouth. Tommen asked questions and was told to be quiet for piety's sake, and Myrcella learned how to listen to people who did not know they were being listened to. Cersei spoke to no one but the septa and the women who brought her food, which she did not eat, and Varys, whom she called names of men because he liked to play at knowing everything, and it amused her to remind him that titles were little clothes men put on to keep their pride from catching cold. Stannis's letter came back rolled like a stick and sealed with a stinging neatness. It did not warm the rooms where men read it. It said that he accepted, as if the law had given him a soup he did not like the taste of but would eat because there were eyes on him. Said that he would come. Said nothing more. Davos looked at it and thought of a boy with scabbed knuckles and the way hunger made the world bright in places and gray in others. He touched the onion sewn on his breast with 2 fingers and said nothing, because he had learned when to talk and when not. Renly came, as he had promised Loras he would, but not with swords drawn or banners loud. He came with a smile and a cloak green as summer and a gift for Sansa that would have made her glad 3 months ago and made her feel cold to look on now. He kissed his brother on both cheeks and looked at the bandage as if it were a lady he might court. "You look well," he said. "I look like a man with a pig's tooth in him," Robert said, but he embraced him with a real warmth that had been missing like a cup on a table without beer. "You look like a boy playing at being a man." "I was made to play," Renly said, cool as a stream. "I'm very good at it." Stannis came 2 days later and did not kiss anyone. He wore black that had been brushed until it went to a shine that showed the weave, and he did not look at the bandage at all. He looked at the throne the way a smith looks at a cracked helm. Consider the flaw. Fix it. He bowed as if the joints of his back had rusted. "It is right," he said in lieu of greeting. "The law is obeyed. The traitors are named." "We'll see to the traitors," Robert said, his mouth twitching with the effort of keeping still. "I named you heir. Do you accept it?" "It is not yours to give," Stannis said, and did not notice how the room tightened its breath at such baldness. "The law gives it. I cannot refuse it. That is not the same as wanting it." Renly laughed. "By the mother, you could sour milk with such talk." "Better sour than rotten," Stannis said. Ned watched them and felt old love and some new pity and a cold he could not name. The brothers were like two sides of a coin that had been in too many hands. One side bright and careless, the other dull and hard, both worn thin where men had rubbed them. When word came that Tywin had drawn deeper south and that a man in red had taken ships along the Blackwater with barrels of pitch and rope, Robert stood. "He'll not burn my river," he said. "He can take my coin and my patience, and he can't have my river." "Send others," Ned said. "Send Stannis. He loves water as a true son of Dragonstone does." Stannis's jaw bit down. "If commanded." "I command it," Robert said after a small pause. "Take your swiftest and hairy. Drive him like mice from a granary." His eyes softened for a heartbeat. "And come back. I've lost too many I didn't mean to. I'm greedy that way." Stannis left with a face like a plank, which was his way of being deeply moved. Renly took his leave to the Roses again with vows to return at need, which was his way of keeping a finger on every cup in the realm. The days fell into a pattern then, the kind that fools mistake for peace. Robert held court and listened to two men talk over a boundary fence as if it were the ocean's floor and the only thing keeping the sea from coming in. He took petitions about grain rot and dirty river water and thieves clever enough to dress as septons. He touched a feverish boy's forehead and gave the mother coin enough to make her weep. He had a bench set for his hand and a stool for the Lord Commander. He trained in a yard as if he were fighting old aches. He did not go to the Street of Silk. Sometimes he looked toward the Armory Hill where Tobomot worked, and when he did his face went curious and soft with the imagining of a meeting that had not yet happened. Cersei prayed when the Septa was there and thought when she was not. She thought about the men who loved her, not much, and the men who thought they had and did not know what love was, which amused her in a clear, crisp little way. She thought about how to move a piece on a board from one end to the other when the rules had been changed. She thought about poison and decided she disliked it because it made men cowardly. She thought about Jaime shackled in a cell whose stone had already learned the measure of his feet. She thought about Joffrey, who did not understand the point of tears and would not learn, and about Tommen, who would have loved a cat in the rain as if it were a brother, and Myrcella, who would grow into something sharp the first time the world let her bleed. She smiled then, small and fierce. She had not lost as long as she had pieces to move. She found one in a place she had once discarded. Grand Maester Pycelle came to her with a phial of clear stuff that smelt sweet and had little threads in it if you held it up to the light. He talked for a very long time about essences and distillations and substances drawn from roots that grew only in the shadow of weirwoods. She listened with her head tilted as if he were pouring wine and she had time to decide if she wanted it. At the end she said, "No," and he blinked because he had expected her hunger. "Something else then," she said. "Something that slows men and makes them old in an afternoon." The old man's mouth opened and shut, and at last he said, "Milk of the poppy is a comfort." "Not that," she said. "I will not comfort him. I will teach him." Pycelle bowed so deeply, he must have felt the bones in his back whisper together. "As my queen commands." "I am no queen," she said, and watched him flinch. "Do you run to him now? Run. Perhaps he will pet you." He ran. On a morning when the cloth merchants' wives were arguing in the market about the price of saffron and a boy on the Street of Sisters cried because someone had kicked his dog, a raven came hammering down out of the sky and straight into the Red Keep's highest rookery window with such fury that the rookery men crossed themselves twice. The birds were wild with it, an emptying and filling of noise that made the air shiver. The raven bore a seal broken and resealed so many times that the wax looked like a scab picked and picked again. The message said what all things eventually do. Something had happened far from here that would bring trouble. A ship burned at Duskendale, Varys told the council, turning his carefully manicured nails in the light. A second was cut from its moorings. A third sailed into the night with a banner on which a heart burned. The garrison reports whispers of a red woman touching her hands to the ropes and leaving handprints charred into them. Stannis, Robert said. He exhaled. He's met her kind. He will meet her again, Varys murmured. Ned thought of small flames on damp wood and of a man freezing for a heartbeat. He looked at Sandor, who sat with his shoulder bound and his eyes absent, and then at Peter Baelish, who toyed with a ring that had not been there yesterday and would not be there tomorrow. This is how it begins, Littlefinger said brightly when no one asked him. With priests and ships and rumors, and before you know it someone is building ladders. It began with lies in a bed, Ned said. It will end with truth. Does anything? Littlefinger returned, smiling. When Stannis returned, he did not come with a red woman, and he did not come with his fleet halved. He came with 3 Lannister ships taken as prize and burned because he did not want to feed the men on them, and with no stories at all. He came ashore with a face as empty of expression as if he had forgotten where he had put them. He bowed to his brother as the law demanded. The river is ours, he said. For now. That will do, Robert said. He clapped him on the shoulder and winced. Sit. Drink. I do not. Drink? Robert repeated, and Stannis, to everyone's mild astonishment and some men's delight, did and made a face like a man who had been tricked into swallowing soap. It took a moment, but then it was like the edge of a cold blade warming in a hand. Stannis's mouth almost softened. We need to write to the lords who want to be told what to do next as if they were children, he said. We will, Robert said. He stood, hammered a hand to the table, and looked at Ned, and after a moment Ned was looking at the boy again, at the stag-headed helm, at the man whose laugh was a vow. We're not done, Robert said. Not with Tywin, nor with that snake Euron who sits his rock and thinks the world is a cup he might break just to watch. Not with what lies over the water either. He did not look at Varys when he said it, though Varys tilted his head as if to hear better the words not said. But we have begun. That night in the city the wind came down from the hills smelling of thyme and crushed nettles. Arya slipped along the roofline above the kitchens and watched the sky. Sansa sat at her window and unrolled a song on her lap and did not sing it. In Maegor's holdfast Cersei lay awake and thought of lions. In the armorer's yard a boy with hair black as midnight hammered a piece of iron into a curve. He could not name and smiled because for once the song the metal sang under his hammer matched the one in his blood. In the king's chamber, where a fire burned as much for the sound as for the heat, Robert sat with a cup he did not drink and his hand on the hammer's haft where it leaned near his chair. He watched the flame turn wood to light. He was not a good man. He knew that. He had been a worse king, but he had today done a right thing. He had taken a truth men had kept under their tongues like poison and spat it out where it could not work in secret. He had pulled a blade from a wound, and though the blood had come bright, it had also come clean. He lifted his eyes and found Ned watching him. You were right, Robert said. About much, Ned replied. About most, Robert answered, and a smile turned, slow, grudging, affectionate. 7 hells, but I hate it when you are. Then hate it more, Ned said. There's much left. The realm does not cure like a cut on a boy's knee. It festers and needs tending. We'll tend it, Robert said, and believed it. For that night he believed it. He set the cup aside, and for the first time in a long time, it did not call after him when he walked away. He did not think of Cersei's mouth or her knives. He did not think of Rhaegar and the rubies. He thought of a black-haired boy somewhere in a city of alleys and of a man of law who had been born wrong for love and somehow exactly right for duty. He thought of a realm that had been a feast where men clawed for meat and left the table full and unhappy. He slept and did not dream. In the dark, the sea made its breathing sounds along Dragonstone's teeth. Across the water and lands where the sheep had different bells and men gave different names to the same stars, a woman with a child in her belly opened her hand to see what lay in it and found only her own palm. She smiled and closed her fingers and made a vow that had no words. Beyond all that, farther than men walk and nearer than prayer, something stirred that had been cold for too long and opened an eye like a shard of ice. The air shivered. In King's Landing, dawn came pale and honest, and the first cries from the fish market rose like a blessing. The city had a new day. It did not yet know what kind of day it would be. It had a king who had lived and had turned his face toward the hard labor of truth. It had a queen in chains who smiled because she knew too many things. It had a hand who counted honor like coin and never found himself in debt. It had 3 children who were not what the world said they were and might become anything. It had a hammer leaned by a chair, and the man who had chosen to lean it and not lift it, for once. And far away, because the world is wide and does not bend to any one tale, a great house that loved its own reflection set more candles burning, and a man with no songs in him marched a host along a river road under banners that glowed like fire in the afternoon. He meant to put out all the other lights. He meant to teach the realm what a lion's love was worth. He did not know that some lessons are learned only when bone meets bone and something breaks that cannot be mended, not even by time. The day had the clean taste of a beginning. The taste lingered. It would sour. It would sweeten. It would end. But for the space of that morning, it was enough to be breathing and to feel the weight of the world as a thing that could be lifted, if only for a moment, by men who were tired and hurt and stubborn and still at last resolved. The bells began to ring for the first prayers, and the sound went west with the wind, over the gate and past the road where hoofprints were already fading, out into the fields where crows were busy, and onward toward places where men were gathering to decide whether they would live in a story told to them or in one they were willing to make.